Hello and welcome to this week's edition of The Olive Tree with me, Julia Fisher, and more news and interviews with believers in Jesus living in Israel and the wider Middle East, including both Jewish and Palestinian people. My guest today must remain anonymous. He's Jewish and lives in Israel. I met him in Jerusalem where we recorded this interview. He was born in America into a secular Jewish family. He studied at Berkley, California, and it was there that he came to faith in Jesus. For him, this was life-changing, and he immediately wanted to test his faith by living outside his comfort zone. Initially, he investigated being a missionary in China, but very quickly he became interested in the Muslim world, as he now explains.
After coming to faith, I was actually in graduate school, and while I was there, I started to get interested in the Muslim world just because of its remoteness, and it's very intriguing. The Middle East, probably as a Jew as well, there was some connection there in my roots as well, and trying to understand. There was also there was a lot about the Muslim world that was unknown at the time, and so it was like a huge sort of vast sort of empty space that people didn't know about it. And there's a side of every young man, I'm sure, that kind of has not only the side of hearing God's call and wanting to serve, but also there's the issue of adventure and going where other people hadn't gone, and being young and being a bit radical, like most Jewish believers at the time. We were a bit extreme. We were trying new things. A lot of the people that were sort of, as I said, that were my heroes, were living in communes and were part of the counterculture movement. Jesus freaks, they were even referred to. And so everything was open. Everything was new. Everything was open. We were ready to try anything. And in graduate school, there was a whole group of men who were teaching on Islamics, actually. And it was extremely interesting to me. I just found fascinating the lives of Samuel Zwemer and others, these first men who went to the Muslim world. There was actually another one who's, that were just sending back ethnographic reports of things they were seeing. So it was all very, very new. The Middle East was just starting as well, probably to become of interest to the Western world in the last 100 years as well, because of World War I, World War II, and oil and everything like that. So, I mean, I didn't know, but I think it had something to do with my background as a Jewish young person, and perhaps even though I wasn't aware of it, the nation of Israel. So my heart was really pulled to the Muslim world just because they were the most unreached of the unreached. And I wanted to give my life in a place where nobody else was. And I wanted to test my faith in an area that would prove that if it doesn't work here, it can't work anywhere. If it works here, it works everywhere. So there was a practical side. There was a side of the unknown that was very attractive, and there was a side of, just for me personally, of wanting to fulfill Jesus' commands to go to all the nations. And maybe that's something that's in every Jewish heart, because it's something that's right at the beginning with Abraham's call to bless the nations.
You traveled to many countries in the world, and maybe it was spending time in eastern Turkey that was the place that was most key in forming the strategy for the rest of your life.
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, in Europe, meeting Muslims in the 1980s was very interesting. That was one of my first contacts with them, more in the Western world, and I quickly met a man who was from right at the border of Russia and Armenia and eastern Turkey, really right at the foot of Mount Ararat, ancient Mount Ararat, and adopted me. It was most likely, at the time I didn't even know really what a Kurd was, but he was a Kurdish person. And I started through that, and then through the work that we're doing, we started to get a lot of understanding about the history of the Kurds as a people. And this was quite impactful. Their ancient roots probably go back to the Medes. And the Medes connection with the Jewish people was something that I ended up discovering even later down the road that convinced me that, hey, this is significant, that here they are, these two people, the Jewish people and the Medes, Jewish people actually in exile in the Medo-Persian Empire had a shared history. And not only that there was between the Medes' faith, Zoroastrianism, and the Jewish faith, post-exilic Jewish faith, the Second Temple period, there was a lot of influence on one another. So, that's another story altogether, but it became a real bridge, which I didn't even know about as a Jewish person, serving among the Kurds. They were quite fascinated. They were quite interested in my heritage, and they actually knew a lot more and provoked me to learn more about the ancient relationship between the Jewish people and the Kurds.
You're Jewish, but you didn't speak Hebrew. You weren't looking to come and live in Israel, but after a few years you found yourself coming and living in Jerusalem. Not the most obvious place to be involved in working amongst the Muslim people.
Well, yes, you're right, absolutely. It wasn't on our, we didn't make it our plan to come here originally. My wife is actually from Turkish national, and we pretty much believed that God had us in Turkey for a period, and then we would be moving east from Turkey. So coming to live in Israel, even as a Jew, was not something most Jewish people that raised in North America, they're thinking, okay, I'll retire in Israel maybe one day. But it wasn't part of our plan to come and live here and use this as a base to go to the Muslim world. It was really not. It became more of a practical issue because we were searching for a place where we could raise our family and live and work in the Middle East, traveling from. And so it was more, in the beginning, it was really more of a practical decision necessarily than a theological or something that people would call even today almost prophetic.
I think you'd be the first to say that you didn't really understand the strategic time and place of you coming to live in Israel. But as your journey has progressed and as things have unfolded, you can see actually that it's very, very linked to the scriptural references and the days in which we're living now.
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, we didn't really understand the significance of what we were doing. And I think a lot of times in our lives, just as individual believers and followers of Yeshua, we only know the will of God looking back. The will of God is 20/20 in retrospect. It isn't always, we were looking through a glass darkly actually when we're moving out. And it became a big part of my own journey, and I believe in our family's journey, is that Abraham went out not knowing where he was going. And when we came here, we actually didn't know the full reasons that God had brought us here. We sort of began to understand, God began to unfold it to us almost as we walked it out. That, hey, wait a minute here, this is why the Jewish people have been called back to Eretz Yisrael. They weren't called to just inherit a land and to be a blessing, to be blessed and to have a great name. They were called here ultimately to bless all the nations of the earth. So we understood that as almost, even most specifically, the nations right around Israel. Now, at that time, that was not really something that people did in a strategic way. But you're right. After we got here, we understood the strategic importance of being here as a son of Isaac, coming back then to live amongst the sons of Ishmael, and seeing that not only was our history connected, but actually our future and our destinies were connected together.
Can you just explain what it means for Israel to be a light to the nations in these days? Because a lot of people just connect Jewish people with the land.
Right. Well, when we, I think for most Christians and New Testament readers and believers, we read Romans and just go right from Romans 1-8 and say, isn't this wonderful? It's just so clear. And, in Paul's writings, oftentimes he'll kind of be systematic at points, and then he'll kind of go off for a few chapters and then come back, and we won't know where he went. And in a way, historically, most Bible teachers and theologians thought, well, 1-8 was great, but then what happens in Romans 9-11? He sort of goes off, and he goes off on this thing about the Jewish people. Where does that go? But if we read a careful reading, I think, of all of Romans, sees that there's actually a very strong, consistent direction in Romans. And then I believe Romans 9-11, Paul really brings everything to its conclusion and its point. And it's all about as we know, it's all about the re-inclusion of the Jewish people back in to God's covenant purposes and promises. And so there is a scripture in there in Romans 11, I think 29, says the gifts and the calling of God are given without repentance. They're irrevocable. And in a way, even if the Jewish people are not walking in their redemption as a people, they're still going to influence nations, for better or for worse, as I say. Sometimes even in a way that even affects how we think to many, many different degrees, whether it's in the media, the arts, whether it's in finances, the legal world, the medical world, wherever it is. And even to the point in the spiritual world, that even Jews are oftentimes even the heads of major spiritual organizations and influence even for worse. So their calling, as God has created them, and this is God's choice, not ours, is to basically bless the nations. That's the purpose. So whether they walk in it redemptively or not redemptively, they will influence nations. Romans 11 through 15 says it like this: if their rejection was the reconciliation of all the nations back to God, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? So my feeling is that, in a way, and hopefully we'll get to this, is that their inclusion will be part of what God's purpose is in his end-time harvest among all the nations.
A Jewish believer in Jesus sharing his story, and we'll hear more from him on next week's programme, when he'll explain the relevance of Isaiah chapter 19 in light of everything that's going on both in Israel and the surrounding nations today. And you're listening to The Olive Tree with me, Julia Fisher. The Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund is a Christian charity based in the UK that supports the needs of both Jewish believers and Arab or Palestinian Christians living in Israel and the wider Middle East. If you'd like to know more about our work and receive our free bi-monthly newsletter, please either visit our website, olivetreefund.org, or write to me, Julia Fisher, at the Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund, PO Box 850, Horsham, RH12 9GA in the UK. Do join me at the same time next week for another story from the Olive Tree. Until then, goodbye.